Good evening and welcome. It's a privilege to introduce this symposium in honour of Joe Isaac. My name's Greg Bamber. I'm at the Australian Centre for Research on Employment at Work and ACREW, and also the Management Department at Monash University. Please switch off your phones. Chris has just asked me to remind you. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered and pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who are present. This is the annual symposium to honour Emeritus Professor Joe Isaac. Unfortunately, he's under doctor's orders to stay at home today as he's recovering from pneumonia. We send him best wishes for a speedy recovery, and he sends his good wishes to you all. He phoned just a few hours ago to pass that on. We're delighted that his son David is here with us this evening, and Trudy. And he told me today he thought a couple of his grandchildren may be popping in, as sometimes they have done in the past, to this event. It's the first time he hasn't been present, sitting in the front row right here and joining in, but he's, as usual, he's been much involved in planning this activity. He's amazing. He's in his mid-90s and he's still as sharp as a tack and an inspiration to us all. These events are organised jointly by Monash Uni and Melbourne Uni, which is Joe's wish, and this reflects his long and distinguished career at both of these fine institutions, which are among the two leading universities in this part of the world. We're holding it on Monash premises this year, but next year it'll be at Melbourne. We alternate hosting. As our Vice-Chancellor, Margaret Gardner, put it when she introduced an earlier symposium, and she sent her apology, she's overseas today, otherwise she'd be here with us again. She said, Joe is a legendary academic who's brought rigour and understanding and analysis to the field of industrial relations, synthesis and judgment to provide policy solutions, particularly in the fields of wages and incomes policy, dispute settlement and labour market issues. And unusually in academia, he's been able to move seamlessly from the world of academia into practice and back again, and do both simultaneously. After being at both universities, for example, and before returning to both of them, he was a deputy president of the forerunner to the Fair Work Commission. And so it's appropriate that several people are here from the Fair Work Commission, including the current president, Justice Iain Ross, who we'll hear from a little later this evening, after the keynote address by Janice Bellace. We warmly welcome Janice and Jeff Latter, her husband, here from the United States. If you've got any questions of Janice or Iain, please save them up, because there'll be time for a Q&A a little later, and then there'll be more informal opportunities for interaction over a drink afterwards. And Joe's been very influential in a range of organisations, not only the ones I've mentioned so far. He was a founding president of the Industrial Relations Society of Victoria, and it's pleasing that there's some good people here from the IRSV. He was also a president of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and there's some Academy Fellows here as well, along with a cross-section of people from unions, employers, economics, the legal profession, consultants and others, including students. And one of Joe's many good ideas was that we should always hold an activity before these symposia for PhD students and early career research as a developmental activity, which we've been doing this afternoon. And we've done this every year with the keynote speaker and a few academics from the two universities. And Joe has always been present and facilitated these in the past, and he's even helped to fund some student grants which have enabled students to come and participate from outside the state of Victoria. Again, this year we've had some students come from Sydney and Western Australia, and even from one from overseas. And colleagues from Melbourne University, Josh and Andi, helped to facilitate this, along with my good colleague Fang Lee Cook this afternoon. Fang Lee Cook, where are you, Fang? Okay, come up. Fang's the Associate Dean of Graduate Research at the Melbourne Business School and Professor of HRM and Asia Studies in the Department of Management, and Fang's going to introduce our keynote speaker. So please welcome Fang Lee Cook.
Well, I feel sorry for Janice in a way, because Margaret, our VC, has gone out of the country, so it reduced to me to introduce Janice. And but ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is my greatest honor to be giving this opportunity to introduce Janice as the keynote speaker for the Joe Isaac Annual Symposium of 2017. As you know, that this is definitely the annual highlights of the industrial relations activities in Australia, no doubt. Although my task is to introduce Janice, but I want to say a couple of words about Joe as a personal tribute. Thanks to Joe, because many of you probably know me, that I came from the UK, migrated in 2010, and before even I came to Australia, I was told by colleagues that I must meet Joe as the living legend of Australian industrial relations, not least because of all the tremendous contribution he has been making in establishing the IR systems in Australia with many other colleagues, and all his dedication of this body of work. And ever since I arrived, Joe has been very kind to me and started to involve me in some of the IR activities that he has been organizing at Melbourne University, and that makes those opportunities of being reconnected with the IR, with the academic world, make my international settlement much easier than it could have been, and because then I had the chance to discuss the IR matters as well. I find that Joe has always been very kind, very gentle, and very encouraging in my research and understanding of the IR issues. And such compassion, gentleness, and inspiration I also found in Professor Janice Bellace. Although I have not met Janice personally until 2013, belatedly so, but I have known Janice's work for a number of years, and I have been an admirer of what she has been doing in the field for a number of years. Professor Janice Bellace was educated at the University of Pennsylvania and London School of Economics. She began her academic career in 1977 at the University of Penn, where she has held a number of leadership positions, including the Associate Provost of the University in 2004, and then later on as the Deputy Provost in 2006 and 2007. Janice has also held the Samuel Blank Chair in Legal Studies since 1996. Professor Bellace has a very broad research interest, as I have experienced this afternoon in our doctoral symposium. But three key strands of her research stands out, and she has been most extremely passionate about, and in which she has also made a significant contribution. These include gender equality, human rights, and international labor standards. Janice has been the author of numerous academic books, book chapters, journal articles, and papers. In particular, her works of freedom of association and the right to strike, as part of the broader human rights issues, have been highly significant in the current climate of economic globalization and what seemingly to be the irreversible global trend of informalization of employment and work, and the decline of labor rights, both in principle and in reality in many countries, particularly in the less developed countries where I came from. So this important body of works highlights not only the responsibility of businesses, but also the crucial role of the state in regulating work and employment relations, in developing a moral economy and equitable growth. In addition to her broad research interests and significant contribution in intellectual work, Professor Janice Bellace has also been spending a lot of her time, devoting a lot of her time in capacity building in the last few decades. I didn't mean to make you sound old, but I know you started your career extremely young, unlike me. And Janice has held numerous international appointments in her global good citizenship and leadership role. To name but a few here, in 1999, Janice served as the founding president of the Singapore Management University. She was a member and chair of the ILO Committee of Experts. Janice was also the president of the International Labour and Employment Relations Association from 2009 to 2012, and it was during her term as the president of ILERA that China became a member of the ILERA. And that was a significant step forward for China, really. And since then, Janice has continued her tremendous efforts in the IR research capacity building in China, and in integrating the Chinese industrial relations community into as part of the international IR community. And since January 2006, Janice has been the director of the Tanoto initiative. It is an initiative supported by a generous gift from the Tanoto Foundation. The initiative seeks, through research and teaching, to engage faculty and students in business and economics developments in Indonesia and ASEAN countries. In short, Professor Janice Bellace is an eminent specialist on industrial relations law and employment and workplace relations, with a critical impact on theory and practice. She has made significant contribution in capacity building, in IR research and education globally. And in the process of doing so, she has encouraged and inspired many women scholars and students as a role model, and she did so with tremendous intellectual strength, personal warmth, and I must say, fragrant elegance. And ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Janice. I'm going to use that. You got. Okay, thank you.
Okay, would you like some water, Janice? There you go. I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. I'm sort of laughing because I wish my mother was here to hear this. It's quite lovely, indeed. And after hearing how I know about so many countries, I do want to start this evening by disclaiming much knowledge about Australia. So I'm not going to speak. I know when to avoid the pitfall of ignorance. I know some things, but not nearly enough to speak with specific knowledge about Australia. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. I first visited Australia in 1992, but not Melbourne until 2013, when the Industrial Relations Society here hosted a World Congress. And I see the judge here tonight, so it's good to see you. My talk this evening, I was trying to think of, many things one could speak about, but I guess that my attention was brought to the fact that I had been sitting through some conferences recently where younger scholars were spending a lot of time on some recent developments, as if these developments were so brand new that they had never been seen before. And a couple of the things they mentioned, I thought, my goodness, a century ago, these same issues cropped up. And so that's what I meant by back to the future, that there are some issues happening right now that strike me as hearkening back to things a century ago because of the economics. Now, so I go back to basics. You all had Econ 1, but sometimes we get so specialized we forget some of the very, very basic things that we were taught years ago. So firstly, when I first did labor law in an American case book, Justice Higgins was quoted in a famous case book in the United States about the eternal conflict between capital and labor. He was essentially saying that there is this eternal conflict and labor is seeking to get more of the profits. But this always happens. One shouldn't have value judgments. It's eternal. But when we think about that, a basic fact is capital buys labor. It doesn't want to buy, it buys no more than it needs to, unless it has to. And it for no longer than it needs it. If it needed it for 5 minutes or 5 days, that's what capital is doing. And it tries to shift the risks to labor wherever possible. So if there's a risk to production or the supply of the service, that's what capital's trying to do. That's a natural driver. You should expect it and be looking for it. If you go back to the late 19th century, now I want to do this from an American viewpoint. In Australia, I'm not sure the time will be exactly the same, but capital buys labor, as I said, not more than it needs. No security of employment. No unemployment compensation. No, I'll pay you for a week if I only need you for a day. No security of employment. As I say, how much does it buy? By the day, maybe less. Day laborers were very, very common. And for no more than it had to pay, and depending upon how many, the supply of workers, it could be quite low. Australia would have been different, but in the United States, with the vast immigration in the late 1890s to right before the First World War, there was an incredible surplus of labor on the East Coast, and you could have people paid very low wages and working very long hours. That's what the market, supply and demand, that's where it was. And when I said capital shifts the risk to labor where possible, the risk of injury, the risk of delay. When I say delay, the machinery broke down. So you're there ready to work. Sorry, we're not paying you because the machinery broke down. Would be an example. A risk that the necessary goods might not be available. So if you were in a garment factory, well, we didn't get the delivery of the fabric. You have to stand here and wait, but we're not paying you until we get that fabric. So all of this was being shifted. Now, I'm going to jump to something. The one big difference between Australia and some other very highly developed countries at the moment is Australia has not had a recession for 25 years. So you haven't had the gloom that much of Europe has had, and the United States, of having a financial crisis, having many people having huge problems with their mortgages, etc. It's been a tremendous issue. And that gloom with job losses has produced a rage. Rage may be a strong word, but real anger. And I think if you look at the election results or the election campaign in both France and the United States, you see a lot of similarities, even though we're very, very different countries. I mean, in both instances, we have somebody who wins who never, ever had held electoral office. It's quite astounding. You have somebody who wins who really isn't identified with a political party. Some of you may know that actually Trump was a Democrat, registered as a Democrat 15 years ago. And he's really not a classic Republican. And Macron starts his own party. So, I mean, they both have a business background. This is very unusual. And part of it reflects an electorate, or a good part of an electorate, that is very dissatisfied with established political parties because they haven't been able to produce the prosperity or the state of affairs that people have come to expect. And that's what one is seeing. So in the United States, international trade and free trade agreements, that's really was a focus of attention. And it's really not free trade agreements. It's international trade that's the cause. And I know it sounds crazy, but if you go back to 1992 and the North American Free Trade Agreement, politicians acted as if this was going to be wonderful for everyone. This was Clinton. This was actually one of Hillary Clinton's problems in the last election. This is going to be terrific. Now, anybody could sit there and say, not everyone is going to be a winner from liberalized trade. And that's the recognition today. Lots of people realize that there are winners and losers, and manufacturing workers in high-wage countries are often the losers. Overall, it may help GDP. Overall, it's bringing countries out of poverty. But certain people are losers in this. And so I cite there a study, which I think to many of you would be obvious, but Otter and others at MIT did this study, and I want to focus on the fact is they looked at local labor markets in the United States by using postal codes. They were looking at local labor markets, and they said, if you were in a local labor market that was susceptible to import competition, so you live in a town, a big town that has a steel mill, for instance, or you make lamps or something, you are in trouble. It can be shown. Rising imports cause higher unemployment, lower labor force participation, people just dropping right out of the labor force, they're not even counted as unemployed, reduced wages in that local area that house the import. And then it goes a steep drop in the average earnings of households. Right? That can be shown, and if you want to, I can give you the citation. It shows right up in the election. How did Ohio vote? Ohio's a state that was very subject to import penetration. That's what I would thought that 1992 you could have predicted this, but the general view put in the media, and it was Democratic politicians for NAFTA saying things will be wonderful, and 20 years later people say, not everywhere, and there's a lot of anger. And the same is true in France, because in northern France that got very hard hit, high unemployment as manufacturing leaves. Now, I'm not saying this is bad. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying things aren't going forward. But to deny that this is happening is to have your head in the sand. And if you're a politician in a democratic country, I don't think that's really very smart. So as I said, the pro-free trade debate in the United States, well, some people would say, well, technology is responsible for lost jobs. Sometimes it is. And higher wage countries need to raise the skill level of workers. Well, that's true, but there's a problem here also. Firstly, as I just mentioned, in many labor-intensive industries, it wasn't technology that caused the job loss in the high-wage country. It's that it goes to the low-wage country. So if you go, and I remember 2 years ago I was in India, and I happened to be in a factory that makes women's clothing, in fact with brands you would recognize. And the technology looked the same as 50 years ago. Actually, it was cleaner and better lit than 50 years ago factories in the United States, but it was the same technology. It's just the low wages. So many jobs are lost to a lower wage country. That's what you would expect. The other problem is raising the skill level of workers. It takes substantial time. And recent work that was done by Agnes Eaton, who won the Nobel Prize, 2 years ago, from Princeton, and Ann Case, has looked at this. Well, first of all, most workers who lose their jobs will never be able, over 50, will never be able to regain their place in the labor market, ever. And they've done a study. Firstly, they were looking at something that's really quite startling. The United States is the only developed country where the labor force participation rate of men, majority white men in their prime age working years between 35 and 54. The labor force participation rate has gone down over the last 10 years. No other countries experienced that. And they looked at that more, and they recently published a study called Mortality and Morbidity in the 21st Century, a nice boring title. If you'd like to read the more readable version, The Atlantic magazine had a very long article, and they gave a better title, Death by Despair. In other words, people who drop out of the labor force become tremendously depressed. Blood pressure goes up, they gain weight, they go on painkillers and drugs, and you actually see rising mortality also in the majority group men more than women. It's a very sad picture, and if you've been in the United States, you've seen a lot of probably headlines about the opioid epidemic. So the reality is that the raising skill levels will take substantial time. I'm sure it will occur, but it'll take substantial time. And even worse, over the past 50 years in an era of deindustrialization, at least in the United States, we haven't demonstrated that we know how to reskill people in any measurable sense of time. So that is not good news. Next good news is when you reskill people, at least in manufacturing, higher tech industries require fewer people. Anybody who's been in an auto plant knows that you can produce the same number of cars with many fewer workers. And in some areas, and we see this in the United States, the supply of educated workers may be higher than the demand. So I don't know about here, but where I live, if you go into Starbucks, most of the baristas have a university degree. About in 2009, there were lawsuits against law schools saying that people had gone to law school, taken out debt to get a law degree, and then they couldn't get jobs because the supply of new lawyers was much greater than the demand. So at the current time, we also have this issue where we're saying we should have more highly educated people, greater numbers of them, or reskill, and at the present time, the new jobs in sufficient number don't seem to be there. Let's look at our external environment. I think there's in many countries, you see this more in Europe, that the industrial relations system that was developed, particularly after World War II, was failing. And I say, well, if we look at the environment, we'll see the reasons. And I'm told here you say the frog in the pot that's boiling. But it's the same image, that if you put a frog into a pan of water and it was boiling already, that frog would jump right out. But if the water was cool and you're gradually raising the temperature, the frog will stay in there and get cooked alive. So have we spotted the changes in the external environment? So the challenge is identifying what has changed in the external environment and then trying to determine how to adapt to that. And can you adapt quickly enough in your environment? We know about globalization, and I'll come back, but it's separate from globalization is actually a change in the way people work, which has a great deal to do with our industrial relations systems in most countries, because in most developed countries, people identified with their work and their status, be it working class, and therefore with a union or with a political party. So if you change the way they work, they begin to change what they identify with, which can create problems for both political parties, for unions, etc. And that's sort of what our industrial relations systems are built on. This rise of the individual, and I say this decline of group identity, somewhat separate from the nature of work, and most of you will know with social media, that people are going into their own narrow groups of interest, looking at their own Facebook friends, their own Twitter feeds, etc. And so people who seemingly are doing the same work and live near each other really are living in somewhat separate worlds. So these are all three are sort of have technological innovation of different types that start these changes, and then you have a series of developments after it. Well, going back to this environment, I'm sure there's somebody who is Australian I could name, but in the United States, John R. Commons is often seen as the labor economist who's almost the founder of the industrial relations as an academic discipline. He said a union must organize the length and breadth of the market, by which he was writing around the time of the First World War. And what he meant was that a union has to organize all the workers who produce a product for the same market before it can be effective in collective bargaining to raise wages. Just think about that. How can one company raise its wages and its cost of production and still compete with another company making the same product for the same market? But if you just think about it, you see it right away, that if you are both producing, you're both producing shoes for the same market, two companies, two sets of workers, how can one raise the wages? Other company will have a cost advantage. So the union of shoe workers would have to organize all the workers. That was the basic premise. You have to take labor out of competition in order to impose the higher wage costs. There was no laws and no other supporting things, just as a basic fact of economics, that's what you would have to do. Which is why unions normally try to, if you go back to the early years of the 20th century, that's what they were trying to do. Although the product market might have been quite small. It might have been a city or the small region of a country. Before globalization, most national labor law regimes were regulating and supporting national industrial relations systems built on that principle. Now, most unions could not organize everybody who was producing the same product for the same market. They might get close, but not everybody. And so labor law regimes usually came in to help them in different ways depending on the country. In Europe, and on the continent, you have where a collective agreement would be signed, make this up, by the Union of Auto Parts Workers would be better. And they'd have most companies included, but not everyone. And so by law, they just extend the terms of the collective agreement to everyone in the industry. The Minister of Labor would do it. So the national labor law helped, in a sense, take labor out of competition, because putting those wage rates onto all employers, whether or not they actually had signed the agreement. In some countries like the United States, it's too difficult to explain what pattern setting agreements are, but it's the same principle. And national arbitration awards essentially can do it also. So there were ways that within a country, when a good part of the workers in some category supplying goods for the same market reached a certain level, the labor law system helped it be extended so that you could take the price of labor out of competition. But globalization, liberalized trade, undermines that foundational principle of nationally based industrial relations system, because you can't extend the collective agreement to another country. Our labor laws are nationally based. Another change in the external environment. These overlap. I realize there's another overlap I hadn't seen, but you'll see it in a later slide. 1973, we have the first oil crisis. Those of us who were, Fang was very nice. I started to teach when I was 10 years old. I just wanted to tell you. But the first oil crisis was immense. Like, the price of oil tripled within a very short time. And of course, the cost of energy in any production system was a profound change. The second thing happened was slower, and it hit the United States first. But Milton Friedman, and I'll just put the blame on him, came out with shareholder theory that I don't know if I want to say sole or primary, read his articles, but the dominant focus of management is what? Maximize the value of the shares. That's what management's supposed to be doing, to the exclusion of almost everything else. Shareholder value, that's it. Well, that means you drive to cut costs at all possible in many different ways. That's how you increase shareholder value. You're cutting costs all over. Since that starts almost at the time of the first oil crisis, the 1970s is not a great period in the United States. In fact, if you go back and look at magazines, they talked about the hollowing out of the corporation or deindustrialization. Production started to move outside the United States before much liberalized trade agreements came in. But, you could say labor might not, labor is not a commodity. But still, it's a cost of production. And if you're a manager that has to cut costs, you look at what you can cut, and labor may be one area you can cut. And that was what one is trying. The next thing in the late 70s and early 80s in various countries, particularly the US and the UK, deregulation. Remember, if you have a regulated trucking industry, a regulated airline industry. That's another way of making wages not susceptible to market forces. So if you say now airlines are supposed to compete with each other, well, they can't compete that well on the price of oil because they don't control that, various things, but they can look at labor. So by the way, it wasn't President Reagan. Once again, it was a Democratic president. It was Jimmy Carter who started deregulation in the United States, but Reagan certainly embraced it, Mrs. Thatcher. It begins to undermine sectoral wage rates in certain industries and the move to enterprise level bargaining. So, change in the nature of work. I'm not going to go through this, but I just noticed those dates, how two of them are 1974. So I said the first oil crisis, 1973, drive to cut costs. And at exactly the same time, you have two major technological innovations. Now seems ancient, but the microprocessor. I was doing my master's degree when there was an article written called The Impact of Microprocessors on Employment. It was written in Europe, and I remember thinking, I don't even know what a microprocessor is. But I got the message. The message is to be a big negative impact on employment. So that was 74, and 74 is also the barcode scanner. If you think how many people used to be employed just sort of tracking things, like the package going from A to B, tracking it, or how many, boxes of cereal are on the shelf, how many people were involved, and then the World Wide Web, obviously. So there's been all these technological developments that have done away with a lot of jobs, and not all in factories. And now we're on the verge of artificial intelligence. Those of you who spoke to Siri today will know that. I don't know how fast it's coming. I put 2020. Warren Buffett was quoted yesterday as saying that he's actually sold IBM stock because he doesn't think Watson will come as fast as he would like it to get a high return on his stock. But it's coming. And so we're going to move from many people doing rote tasks, be they manual rote tasks or mental tasks, to fewer people using their minds. So what jobs will there be for those jobs displaced by artificial intelligence? Now, I'm hopeful. I think in the future there will be, but I'm worried about the gap, like the next 10 years, or those of you who have a child at university right now taking out loans, like what jobs will there be in 10 years as a lot of jobs get wiped out very quickly? Stiglitz, by the way, this is a really good book, which didn't get that much coverage, The Price of Inequality. It didn't get, one of the reviews said the problem with the book is he covers too much. Well, I thought it was a nice, in other words, try to be more simple, but Stiglitz, being a Nobel Prize winning economist, sort of was able to cover a lot of things. But he says that the dearth of jobs and the asymmetries of globalization have created competition for jobs in which workers have lost and the owners of capital have won. In other words, at the present time, because the numbers of jobs have gone down so fast, and globalization has favored certain countries because of low-wage manufacturing, right now workers are in a very poor bargaining situation. Very poor. People, in some senses, are desperate for work, or else they would never take work on the conditions that are, the terms being offered. And that's what he mentions. A rising tide. Now, you've heard a rising tide lifts all boats. I can have two views. I said, well, not necessarily, or my other view that I wrote in the paper is, well, it may lift all boats, but as the super luxury yacht goes by, the little rowboat might get swamped in its wake. So it's a difficult question, and I don't want to go into it, except to say right now, I agree with Stiglitz, that we're at a situation that more people are chasing work. And the power is on one side, and there's not much countervailing power. I mean, most of us know, and Greg was good to give me the data, but in the United States right now, he didn't give me this, he gave me the Australian data, which is similar. He said about 10% of the private sector labor workforce is unionized. In the United States, it's about 6% of the private sector. There are more undocumented workers in the United States than there are private sector unionized workers. So right now, there's not much bargaining power on the individual worker side. So going back, I want to say, because I'm a labor lawyer, and these are my last ones. There's a very famous saying, some of you who are lawyers probably read Otto Kahn Freund, who said, trying to remind lawyers that the primary force in labor relations is economic, that law's secondary. We sometimes think that somehow you can pass a law and it can change things. And he was focusing on the fact that there are economic forces and that the purpose of labor law is to restrain, support, or regulate the inherent economic power. He used the terms labor and management. And I'd rather say capital. But the issue in 2017 is how would you want to restrain the inherent power of capital? In a democratic society, what are you trying to achieve? So what's the problem? The traditional ways of supporting workers are ineffectual. Collective bargaining doesn't work when workers have no strike power, which I think lots of workers have realized, which is why they are not joining unions. And it doesn't labor law, employment law does not apply when people doing work are not deemed to be employees. I'm making a broad statement there. I'd have to look at every country. But in the common law, usually, for labor law to apply to you, you have to be an employee. So you have a contract of service or a contract for service. So how do you restrain or regulate capital so as to support the average working person who may not be an employee, deemed to be an employee under the law? Back to the future, just really quickly, crowdsourcing. So today they talk about crowdsourcing. You log onto the platform and you bid for work. Well, in the early 19th century, a ship would come in, or ships would come in, and people swarmed down to the dock, right? That's crowdsourcing. And the person who was the ship owner's agents were getting the lowest price. The gig economy. Do you get paid for 5 minutes, a day, or whatever? That's a musical term. It's a performer's term. So today, TaskRabbit, Mechanical Turk, it's the same thing. It's the gig economy. Or how do you match demand for labor with supply of labor? So Uber tried to defend, well, it does say this, but in the British court, they said, we're not an employer, we're a technology platform. We just match supply and demand. Well, we had that in the 19th century also. So in my view, this is, it's sort of old wine in new bottles. So we put a new label on it, but it's the same phenomenon. And the same phenomenon is that people are doing work, but they're not getting the terms that they need to support themselves. What do I see for the future? I don't see, and I don't want to be negative about unions, but in general, I don't see unions as being the focal point for bringing workers together to get better terms and conditions. I see some sort of political party, a network, we would call it now, I was just reading some Labor Research Action Network, workers' political parties doing it, and these political leaders proposing and rallying support for changes that are not based on traditional employment, but linked to individual and units of work. So that we think about, what do we need? We need support for higher education and training. We need home ownership, some way to support that through what you make, your earnings. We need long-term savings for retirement. We need things like schemes for insurance for sickness and disability. And to tie it to some old-fashioned notion of employment is not going to work in the 21st century. So we can't use our models that we developed for an industrial age, for the information digital age, but we still have, people have the same needs. And that's what our labor laws will have to be looking at. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Janice. And we're going to formally thank you a little later, but in the meantime, I'd like to welcome to the stage His Honour Justice Iain Ross, AO, who was Joe's personal first pick to be the discussant and make some comments this evening. Most of you know, have you got the judge. He came as a child from Bonnie, Scotland, and has many talents. He's worked for the ACTU and the legal profession and sat on the bench. He has tertiary qualifications in law, economics and business from Monash University and also Sydney University. And his current appointments include being a judge of the Federal Court of Australia and, most importantly in the present context, the President of the Fair Work Commission. So, Iain, the stage is yours, please.
Cool. Thanks. I wanted to touch on three aspects of Janice's presentation, the three issues that impact on IR systems and relate them to our own experience. So if you look at globalisation, there's not much doubt that we're a small open economy and we've been the subject of the changes that that's brought about. We've also been an economy in transition, and this is really the contribution of mining and non-mining sector investments. And you can see the black line, which is on the left curve, mining increasing up to the peak point. It's declined since, and we've seen since that peak, 2012-13, the economy transitioning from mining into the services sector, and we've also seen the decline in manufacturing, and that's been played out in employment as well. If you look at the second issue, the changes in the way people work, well, we're subject to the same changes. I think it was Linda Grattan who said that the future's here, but it's just unevenly distributed. And as you walk around, you'll see the decline of the video stores. The toaster photo is our toaster broke, and I remember having a discussion at home about maybe we should get a toaster repair person, but try to find one of them in the white pages. And one of the reasons is the price drop. And you've had the disruptors, the Uber, the Airtasker, the range of other online and other platforms that Janice mentioned. We've also seen some trends play out in the labour market. We've seen the decline in male participation rate, the increase in female participation rates over time. We've seen an increase in casualisation over time. And we're now starting to see a shift in job tenure, particularly for that group 25 to 44, and indeed starting to see some shifts in the over 45. And I think we'll see that trend accelerate, particularly as you've got a significant proportion of males over 45 who've been long-term employees in manufacturing, vehicle manufacturing and the like. And as that sector declines, it'll impact on those numbers. There are various estimates of how many jobs will be affected by computers, robotics, artificial intelligence. This one speaks of about 40% of the workforce facing a high probability of being replaced over that 10 to 15 year period. You see the variety of estimates about this, but the one common element is that there is going to be an impact. But when and how much is really the area of debate. And there are consequences to these shifts in the nature of work and in the sectoral shifts. And one of the consequences is an increase in income inequality over time. And that's demonstrated by, as you see, time on the bottom axis, that fanning of the different quintiles or percentiles of earnings. And this is despite the fact that the lowest earning level has increased in real terms. What you've seen is an opening up of income inequality. We've similarly to the US, we've seen the decline in union density, and this is associated with, this is an illustration of the rise in the individual and the decline in group identity. I've got a slightly different take on the decline in group identity that I'll come to, but you can see it's declining in the private and public sector. now around 10% in the private sector. That plays out in other ways. If you look at industrial action, collective industrial action has pretty much flatlined. And there's a relationship between the drop in union density and the decline in disputation. So, and that's shown here. As you see, union density in particular sectors, and these are ones that have been characterised historically by industrial action, as that shifts to the left, so disputation and collective bargaining declines. That's played out in the Commission's workload. If you look at 10 years ago, about 2/3 of our work would have been collective dispute resolution and about a 1/3 individual. And now we've seen that invert. 2/3 are individual actions, unfair dismissals, general protections, and only 1/3 collective. And that shifted our focus to how we deal with it because they're different parties. They're no longer repeat players. It's no longer unions and employer organisations. It's individuals or one-shotters who only had one engagement with us. So how do we cope with that? I'm not sure that I'd necessarily characterise it as a decline in group identity. I think it's the group that they're identifying with that's changed. At least in my direct experience with both my children and the young people in their 20s that I work with, it's not that they're focused on their individual identity, it's just that they're not necessarily engaging with a group that's work-related. Their group has different connections, and I think that in part explains the decline in union density, and probably the sectoral shifts have an impact as well. The questions about the changing in the way we work, I think it's not necessarily all in one direction. There will be other work and other initiatives will come, as we've seen historically. Or to give you a picture of this, this is a business that established that when you want to move house, you, instead of moving your stuff into a storage facility, it's a storage facility in a box. And this was what one of my daughters did, put all her storage stuff in a box and then enlisted Sarah and I to move it. I will give you one tip though with these new things, that should you be moving a fridge up 2 flights of stairs, you might check that she hasn't stored all of her university books inside it before you do it. I think that as Janice was suggesting, there needs to be a focus on these issues and these trend lines and how do we respond to them. And I agree, we do need to have a national conversation about these issues. And I think while the starting point might be a reconsideration of the purpose of labour law and how it applies, I think it needs to be a broader debate. And it needs to look at, well, what does the future look like for us? What sort of future do we want? And have a debate about that. What sort of guaranteed levels do we want in a society? And once you've reached a position around that issue, well, how do we get from where we are now to where we're going? Because labour law will deal with parts of it, but the impacts of these shifts are across many parts of the economy. The shift from the traditional employee employment notion not only has an impact on the protection and the benefits for that employee, but it impacts on the tax system, the revenue base that's used to fund other services. It impacts on retirement income policy, which later then has an impact on the revenue base and how we deal with those issues. And it is a conversation about, well, where do we fit in this globalised world? What's our comparative advantage? What do we think we're going to be good at? And then how do you match up all of the other policy initiatives, whether it be education, infrastructure, how are they geared to providing well played, meaningful work for those that want it into the future. So I think I agree that there are challenges for labour law, and there have been challenges that have come up in the past, and we should have that conversation. But the only thing I would add was I'd want to broaden the conversation. And I think the conversation has to start with people in the room. I'm not sure the conversation is going to leap off the pages in the political sphere anytime soon. And we have similar trends, though not the same. It hasn't played out into a leadership perspective, but it has in our political dialogue as well. And so whilst it's true we've not had a recession for a period, and we have to a significant extent been protected from the winds of change, there's not much doubt that we're a small open economy in a global world, and we do face the same challenges. They may not be as visible yet, but they're certainly there in different parts of the economy, and it's timely that we have the conversation and start to address them.
Yep. Well, thank you very much, Iain. Now we have question and answer time and some discussion time. Who'd like to kick off the discussion? And when you're raising a question or comment, please could you mention your name? And I'm going to suggest there might be 2 or 3 people wishing to come in. Who'd like to start the discussion? Thank you. Courtney, just over here. Your distinguished colleague from the University of Melbourne. And Janice, I wondered if you might like to take a note of a few questions. We might get 2 or 3 questions on the floor because we don't have a lot of time, and then you can give some response. Please.
John Freebairn, University of Melbourne. I'd like to take issue with Janice on how terrible international trade is. You gave us a good story of the losers, and that's very blatant. But on the other side of the story, there are at least 2 sets of important winners. And one is lots of employees in export and other import competing industries who get cheaper imports. So the classic is Australian agriculture, who was strung up with having to buy very expensive protected cars and trucks and whatever. Suddenly we took off tariffs off the car industry, trucks and cars came down. Your story was right. The car industry employees took a pounding. But for the farmers and for others using transport equipment, this was God's gift. The other gift was, of course, to consumers. We suddenly got decent cars at half the price. Now, they're very hard to sell those stories. And so we hear all this, free trade's a bloody disaster. I think in fairness, we need to say there are lots of other pluses, but they're harder to tell.
Thank you. Who else would like to come in? Courtney, there's one over here on this side.
I suppose my question is,
would you just like to give us your name or...
Hannah Piterman, independent consultant and also associated with Monash University.
Thanks, Hannah.
So my question is about the future, and if this trend continues, when I say a trend, I talk about the normalisation of inequality. And yes, I agree with John, there are winners and there are losers, but the winners constitute a very small, an increasingly smaller proportion of society, and the losers are increasingly a bigger majority. And we have this concept of the trickle down, and somehow if the few winners do well, and I'm sort of referring to this an idea of bully capitalism that I think is occurring. So, and I'd be interested in Janice's view on Trump and where all this is heading, because and I'm asking, are we heading for a revolution? Because this is not sustainable. And last night I went to hear Joe Camilleri, and he talked about ethics, but what he said, this is not about ethics. This is about a lack of intelligence in our leaders. So when Clinton thought he was doing such a great thing, he wasn't strategically intelligent. What will happen to society in the future if we continue down this track?
Thank you.
So for Iain and for Janice.
Okay, thank you. Was there a question over at the back there? Richard? Yes. Professor Richard Mitchell, Monash University.
I don't know how my question will fit in with Hannah's. Hello, Hannah. I'm a friend of Debbie's, Hannah. But the issue is really in conversation about labour law that we don't really even start to get near the point. And I think this was the point that Iain was trying to make, really. And thus he and Janice can both think about this. But there's all sort of discussion goes on in labour law community and in books and articles and so on to do with work. But the key issue about labour law has always been really the economic security of labour. It's about money. It's not about work. And how the hell are we actually going to change the conversation? I mean, no one picks this up or talks about it in political terms, but how do you even change that sort of conversation inside universities and textbooks and so on? Very difficult. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. And Janice and Iain, would you like an opportunity to respond?
Thank you. By the way, I should tell people that Trump and I were at the Wharton School at the same time. But
Trump is a graduate of your school.
Yeah, he is. I was first year. He was fourth year. The Wharton School, and so we really do love trade, by the way, and we're sometimes considered the home of capitalism, but I'll skip that. I actually do think first of all, international trade is going to happen, and consumers gain. So I happen to agree with you. Some people gain more than others, but it's a given. In fact, I'm sort of sad that for some bizarre reason we've pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so the thing's fallen apart, which I thought would be a great advantage in Asia. But I think the real issue I see is that's why I kept mentioning democracies, that without people thinking about it, in many of the developed countries and democracies, there's a feeling that if you go to school and you work, you should have some security in your life. So I agree with Richard. It's not so much about work as or it's money. Like somehow I can live. I can have a house. I can have a car. I can live. And that's what's breaking down right now. Some segment of the population feels that if we want to use the word social compact, but it's not formal, that this either has broken down or somehow they're getting the short end of the stick. And I think that's where I see the issue. When Iain showed about the wages, the one thing in the United States, twofold, is the real wages of men with a high school diploma, like finishing age 17, have been flat for 20 years. And in the last, I think since the year 2000, it's been the same for those with university degrees. So I just want to say, like, the purchasing power, therefore, is somewhat down, growing inequality, whatever you say. Some people say that inequality isn't the issue. If people felt that they could have the life they wanted, the house, the car, the education for the kids, that the fact that somebody's making $50 billion is almost irrelevant. You really begin to focus on inequality when on a big portion of the population feels that somehow they don't have enough. So it's sort of like Louis XIV, the people. That's where I feel that we can't be complacent in democracies. And maybe Australia even more, because Australia's always seen itself as a lucky country, I think. It's God's own country. And if things change, Australia also may have what's happening in the United States, which I think, when I think about immigration, which I didn't mention, in the United States, I think people have like sort of schizophrenic. Our nation was built on immigration, so of course you have to be pro-immigration. It'd be terrible not to. On the other hand, when you don't think there are enough jobs around or people not making enough, you become very concerned about millions of people coming in the door. So the current anxiety over economic security is huge, and it's an issue. I agree. I'm talking as a labor lawyer because that's the only piece I deal with, but it's part of a much, much bigger picture about how we give a basic income to people to be able to survive in society.
If I can deal with the trade point first, I think most people would recognise that, yes, there are winners. Steps are going to be taken to assist them to transition, because it might work in theory that vehicle manufacturers can look for other areas of growth in the economy, aged care work, hospitality work. Well, I'm not sure how much of a realistic option that is, because you can have a mismatch of skills, you can have a mismatch of location and those sorts of issues. So I think it's the transitioning question. I think most people would accept that there are winners and losers from trade, but what do you do for the losers? As for whether there'll be a revolution, I think there will be a change. I think you pay a price for rising inequality, and you pay a price in social adhesion. So we're starting to see a bit of that in some of the anger that's played out, the rise of minor parties, those sorts of issues. And I think I'm not suggesting people will take to the streets and overpower the government, but there's a rising level of anxiety and dissatisfaction with the impact on individuals of some of these changes, and that's played out in a whole range of different ways. And I agree with Richard that it isn't just about the legal conception, it's about more than that. As to how you start that conversation, how you start a conversation about guaranteed income and those sorts of issues, and get traction, I don't know. But I think at least starting the conversation about what are the impacts of all these shifts, and more importantly thinking about, well, if you were just to free-form think, what sort of country do I want to live in 15 years? How do I want it to be characterised? Do you want it to be characterised as individualistic, remove constraint on your capacity to do things? Do you see a more regulated outcome with more distribution of earnings and wealth? And people have different points on that continuum, but I think the important point is to start the conversation about, well, where do we want to be? Because if we don't have that conversation, we'll drift into a future that we may not want. So at least we should engage in the debate and have some control over what it looks like.
Well, thank you, Judge. And the perfect person to propose a vote of thanks this evening is Dr. Andi Pekarek. Andi did his PhD at Monash, and then he was employed at Melbourne University, and he's now come back to Monash on his sabbatical leave from Melbourne University. So he like Joe, has spanned both institutions. So Andi, take it away. And Andi's from, on behalf of University of Melbourne, symbolising this is a joint activity.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I'm Andi Pekarek. I'm an industrial relations academic in the Department of Management and Marketing at the University of Melbourne. On behalf of everyone here, I'd like to extend our sincere thanks to Professor Bellace for her very illuminating and thought-provoking address. Warm thanks also to Justice Ross for his insightful discussion. It's great to have a perspective from the institutional coalface. I'd also like to acknowledge Emeritus Professor Joe Isaac in whose name this symposium is held every year, and all those who have helped put this event together. Professor Bellace's work clearly bears the imprint of her vast experience. As an academic labour lawyer who understands business, she has both local expertise and a keen grasp of international developments. As I'm sure the academics here will agree, in an age where impact and engagement are becoming increasingly important performance measures for university researchers, a long-standing involvement with the ILO is surely an exemplary way of making a meaningful and far-reaching contribution. One common thread cuts across Professor Bellace's work. How can companies ensure that they meet workers' basic human rights while also maintaining a sustainable basis for economic activity? How best to reconcile what we might call the three central pillars of industrial relations: equity, voice, and efficiency? Recently, she has explored the decline of the union movement in the US and advocated for new mechanisms to give working people a voice in the public policy arena. She's also questioned how well corporate codes of conduct are supporting companies' obligations at work under human rights law. Her earlier work addressed gender pay equity and the role of the state in industrial relations. In short, Professor Bellace has consistently grappled with some of the most critical issues in industrial relations. I'd like to very briefly touch on some of the key points she made in her address. The professor's talk was titled Back to the Future. As she points out, we are now on the cusp of, or perhaps in the throes of, another great wave of social, economic and technological change. The landscape of work is in profound flux. How well has IR law kept pace with these rapid reconfigurations? We know that different economies face their own unique circumstances, but broadly speaking, traditional IR mechanisms and institutions can be slow to adapt to our current day realities. As she argues, we need to find new solutions and policy settings that will bring IR systems into line with the nature of work today, and to ensure that these new frameworks are flexible enough to remain relevant in the future. So how do we get from here to there? Professor Bellace points to an urgent need for greater creative thinking by those who speak for working people, by unions, by political leaders, a bolder, more imaginative, forward-thinking approach. Companies are not exempt from this call to action. As her work suggests, perhaps it's also time to reconsider the question, what obligations do employers have to workers? These questions also resonate strongly here in Australia, where industrial relations is a hot topic in public debate. A few select examples include the exposure of systemic underpayment of workers in 7-Eleven stores and other franchises, with migrant workers particularly affected. Last week, Fairfax journalists, the very people who were instrumental in exposing that underpayment scandal, embarked on a 7-day strike over proposed job cuts. We've seen some tinkering around 457 visas and skilled migration, and a number of states are now moving towards licensing schemes for labour hire companies. No doubt, Professor Bellace can attest to the ILO's promotion of social dialogue as the central mechanism for developing better living and working conditions. So, an emphasis on negotiation, consultation, and the exchange of information between governments, employers, workers, and other stakeholders on common interests around social and economic policy. We see this idea reflected in the professor's work, and indeed in our coming here together today. The Joe Isaac Symposium is all about the exchange of ideas, and I think we can all agree that social dialogue is part of the reason we've gathered here today. So on that note, refreshments await. This is the perfect opportunity to meet and start some conversations about what we've heard this evening. Thank you, Professor Bellace, and thank you all.
Well, thank you very much, Andi. And many others have sent their best wishes and apologies that they're not able to be here this time. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and in particular thank our good colleagues at Melbourne Uni for collaborating with this. Apart from Andi, there's a whole team of Prakesh and Michelle and Courtney and Peter and others. And thanks to the good team at Monash who've helped to make this happen behind the scenes. Chris and Colm and Gary and Fang and Richard, Kerry, Chris, and a team of students who've helped as well, Adi and Chana and Matin. And I'd also like to, in closing, let us remember Golda, Joe's late and dear wonderful wife, who in the past has always been present at these symposia, sitting in the front row with Joe and always much engaged, and she's greatly missed. And it's lovely that both David and Debbie, two of their great children, are here with us this evening. And thank you again all for coming. Melbourne University already planning next year's event and have lined up a great speaker. Hope to see you again next time. In the meantime, safe journey home, and please join us for a drink and a discussion. Chris, just outside the door here.
No,
tell us where, Chris.
Go straight up to the end and turn.
Okay, past the lift and turn right.
Yeah, past the lift,
okay.
turn right, and
so we'll have lots of opportunities for further discussion.
lots of delicious
Delicious warm food and good drinks. So give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you very much.